Welcome to Council Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. I'm Linzi Goldthorpe, Associate Director at the agency. And today I am with our Joint Managing Director, Ben Girdleston, who is fresh from his trip to the US. How are you, Ben? How was the trip?
I'm many things, but fresh is not one of them. I've still got the slight sort of jet lag hangover going on. I got back at the weekend, and we're recording this on Wednesday lunchtime, and feel better than I did yesterday. But I am okay, but I wouldn't describe myself as fresh. But it was an amazing trip. It was really, really good.
And you were over there seeing clients, but also hopefully had a bit of downtime too. What's the mood like over there? Who were you able to get around and see?
Yeah, so I was there for 2 weeks. I was very lucky. I went to Boston, where I've never been before, and it's fantastic. What a lovely, lovely city. I was there for 4 days. Normally on holiday, I did a couple of meetings. It's a very nice place, but there are some big firms there like Ropes and Gray and others. I was just doing a bit of research. Some of the offices, some of the law firm offices are in Boston are very, very large. We don't really hear that much about it on that side of the pond, but it's very significant. Then I went down to DC. I spent 3 days kind of working in DC. We at Byfield, we've picked up a number of clients who are either based in DC or have significant offices there over the last year or so, and it's really interesting. I don't think it's a coincidence that what's happening politically there and some success for us are happening at the same time. I think the market there is very, I don't want to use the word insular, that's not right, but it's very contained. It's very contained. It's a very politically dominated and quite transient business environment. That said, everybody seems to know everybody, and it's reasonably small, and it's what we would describe here as a bubble. A very, very different vibe to New York, where I was all of last week. We've got obviously a number of clients there, but I saw a number of agencies and some prospects as well. And I've talked about this before on the podcast, but I'm so struck by how small the Atlantic seems in terms of the differences or whatever word you would want to use between the New York and London markets. They are so similar. What's playing out here is playing out there, just at a slightly pacier pace, for want of a better expression. But yeah, it was a really, really, really good couple of weeks. Really, really, really enjoyed it.
Great. I'm glad. Yeah, well, we're glad to have you back. And one thing that, must be dominating conversations out there, and we've continued to see in reporting this week, obviously, is the continued pushback on the executive order. So I think jumping into the first story that we flagged and want to discuss this week is the fact that Paul Weiss, Kirkland and Skadden have pushed back on latest lawmaker letters. So this was a piece by Abigail Adcox from law.com today. These three firms have pushed back against the Democratic lawmakers who are questioning whether their pro bono work for the Trump administration could breach ethical standards. How much of this issue continues to kind of dominate conversations whilst you're out there? I mean, what's your take on the situation at the moment?
Well, nobody will be surprised if I start by saying in DC it was very, very dominant. Clearly, from a lateral hiring perspective, there's still a lot of people coming out of government into private practice, and the kind of repercussions of executive orders, etc., are dominating the agenda there. This story is fascinating because there's some macro political stuff to put over the top of it. I think if people rewind just before the election, so gosh, almost a year, there was quite a lot of coverage about numbers of firms that were either working for the Democrats or people that were funding the Democrats who would come down on the side of the Democrats. And I'm not saying any of the firms in this piece were part of that, but for Democratic lawmakers to push back on the legal profession around pro bono work is quite punchy, because if you think about it, the American electoral cycle is only 4 years. In a couple of years' time, the Democrats will be revving up again to challenge. I don't know if it'll be Trump or somebody else. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. The next
Another
election.
episode, maybe.
Yeah. But they'll be looking for funding.
Mm.
and if they've upset enough of the, big, big firms in terms of attacking what they doing from a pro bono perspective after the agreements with Trump, then you might get some friction there. So I think the Democrat lawmakers being punchy here are maybe being a little bit short-sighted, because in a few years' time, they will need legal advice, they will need funding, etc. And you're always struck, aren't you, by how close politics and big law is in the US. Very, very different here, and it's not just around Trump and executive orders, etc. They're completely intertwined. I think this will play out in the medium term. I don't think it's just about Trump and pro bono, etc. But I wonder if the Democrats are being a little bit short-sighted here by they're obviously doing some political point scoring by attacking the validity of what these firms are doing after their agreements with Trump. But I kind of wonder what the payback will be them in the medium term.
Yeah, I think it's definitely one that we're going to be continuing to following for a long time yet. And then slightly different story, but back in the UK, the lawyer had a fantastic piece this morning. Not heard of Setfords, you have now, which is basically highlighting a Guildford-based firm. So we've gone across the pond, whose revenues jumped over 50%, thanks to, as they say, improvements in automation from private equity backing. Now, private equity investment in law firms is a continued trend that we're seeing, and it seems to be that nearly every other week we're hearing of another firm that's either speaking to private equity or has taken investments. What do you think this means for the legal sector as a whole? Do you see this as a positive development?
I do. I think it does on two levels. Setfords, without getting too technical, are a different type of firm. They're based on they actually started it, I think, when they were founded, I'm guessing about 20 years ago, in 2005, 2006, that they pioneered the consultancy model of UK law, which is a very different way of delivering legal services. There's a number of firms that do that, like Level Law and one or two others. But the private equity point is really significant. So they've had significant, sorry to repeat the word, private equity investment recently, and are doing really, really well as a result. And I kind of circle back to the kind of wider discussions that we've had, where we've talked about private equity investment in law firms. And some people, including me, have sort of questioned how it might work, certainly from a big law perspective. Partnerships, etc., quite quirky places, aren't they? And having private equity in there trying to drive
Mm.
synergies, efficiencies, etc., feels a bit countercultural to the partnership model. But it's very easy just to be in the big law headspace with that. I think when you move down to the slightly smaller firms in the 200, a lot of them are a bit like accountancy firms where they sell process and structure, and Setfords do exactly that. And if you're investing in a firm where you've got some certainty around the delivery model, particularly where they're like, personal injury firms, which are kind of retail at the end of the day, and it's a very predictable business, you're going to get bang for your buck as a private equity investor, and your investments are going to pay fruit. So I like the Setford piece in the lawyer this morning, because it shows that private equity investment will work in certain types of firms that sell a lot of automation and process organization,
Mm.
but also kind of predictable work. I think.
Mm.
I think so. Other firms which may do well are those types of firms. I still personally remain a little bit skeptical about how private equity investment will play out in some of the bigger firms. I've talked about Clifford Chance a few times, only because they have vaguely hinted at the fact they might be interested in private equity investment. I
Mm.
personally think that might be a bit of a struggle for the cultural reasons I've given, but you can see it working well here. So I agree with highlighting this week for sure.
Yeah, it's an interesting one from a brand perspective, as you say, because there's also the emotional element tied to a brand. So if you're driving efficiency and technological change, for a lot of people who have emotional ties to the brand, like, is that going to resonate with existing client base. So I'd be interested to see the way that some of these developments, I think, Setfords has talked about efficiency quite a lot, and it was a word that kept coming up. How that does impact the brand loyalty going forward, and whether that's going to be a consideration for other firms that are looking to make these sorts of deals.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, Setfords are a disruptor, aren't they? The model that they have, those types of consultancy-based firms, which are very different partnership structures to traditional firms, they're disruptive by nature. I think that if you're buying into that brand equity as a client or a employer or anybody else, you're buying into that as disruption. So in a sense, private equity investment feels a bit disruptive. If you I'm not necessarily kind of wanting to pick out individual names, but if you're a classic sort of corporate client of a corporate firm, and that firm suddenly gets a private equity investment, you might get slightly freaked out by that from a brand connectivity point of view. But I think if you're a client of a disruptive type of firm, and I mean that in the best possible sense, then you're probably going to think private equity investment is okay, as long as it's delivering efficiencies, and it doesn't mean that they're going to be trying to charge you more.
So another story that we spotted this week, and Ben, you wanted to dig into this a little bit, was the latest ALM Global 200 and the firms that we've seen coming through in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I still had slightly my US trip head on, and I was intrigued actually by ALM's Global 200, which was released, I think, this week. And I was really surprised in a very good way that of the top 200 firms, 11 of them are continental European firms. So firms that people classically associate with particular European countries. Garrigues and Cuatro Cruces, excuse my pronunciation, are a case in point from a Spanish perspective, but then firms like Henkel and Müller in Germany. I don't think we talk enough about the continental European markets and some of the really good firms that are operational there. It feels sometimes that the only time that we do is when US firms go into places like Milan or other key European markets, or Madrid and start, or Paris particularly, and hire from local firms in a big way. So I was really pleased to see this, and some of these firms, such as the ones I've mentioned, have got real international scale. Um, particularly from the Spanish perspective in LATAM. They have several offices and some significant size in the US as well. So some of these firms that we kind of know but probably don't know well enough are a lot bigger financially and demographically than I think that we than I think that we know. So I really just kind of wanted to give a hat tip to Europe here.
And I think there's a lot to be said about being able to tell that communication story across however many offices, like 17 offices, markets, that's cohesive, but also relevant to local markets. So it's a really interesting one from a comms perspective as well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I fully agree. And even those of us that have been around the sector for a while are often quite surprised at some of the scale that some of these European firms have. And again, it's really good to see them in this list.
We were talking earlier about the future of perhaps the legal model and private equity investment. Something else that we saw this week that was quite interesting was the impact that AI is continuing to have on big law. And there was an interesting piece from Ryan Harroff at law.com, who was talking about the AmLaw 200 hiring CIOs, CTOs, as AI and cybersecurity are completely reshaping how firms operate. I think the salaries are being touted as being quite high. The roles are in demand. Why do you think this is happening now? And did you see any of this when you were out in the States? Was there any conversation about how the AI model is impacting internal hiring?
No, but that's why it was quite interesting to see this piece. So just to be absolutely clear, so CIOs, chief information officers, CTOs, chief technology officers, and the piece is obviously in the management section of law.com is looking at the obviously firms have already always had those roles, but the fact that there is a bit of a war for talent for those roles, and their pay is now, and this is in the middle of the piece, but this is the most interesting thing for me. So the CIOs and CTOs tend to earn more than their counterparts in finance than the CFO, and that tells you, without being glib, that firms seem to be focusing more on innovation and tech and AI than they are on chasing bills. And I think that's really fascinating, and it says that CIOs and CTOs are earning as much or even more than heads of marketing, heads of BD, CMOs, and that they earn quite a lot. So it's really significant. So clearly, it's a very good time to be a chief technology officer. And thinking back to my own time in house, and I know you obviously spent some time at DLA, Lindsay. It often felt that technology teams were there to support the business, which is great, rather than the client, if you know what I mean. So it was more about the technology infrastructure, laptops, all that sort of really good stuff. Whereas now they're more outward facing. Whereas a lot of that work would have sat with innovation, technology are getting involved with delivery of stuff to clients, which I think is great. Having working in a law firm, if you are in some respect, even if you're one step removed client facing, or your work has a direct positive impact on how the firm delivers to clients, that's got to be a good thing. So I see this story as a positive. But nobody asked me about AI or CIOs or CTOs in the States, but I still thought this piece was absolutely worth flagging.
Yeah, really interesting, and from a comms perspective as well, being able to tell that story of innovation, as you say. I think law firms innovating isn't a new thing. It's just shifted quite dramatically from the infrastructure and the delivery and the optimization, from hardware and now to AI. But being able to tell a story that fits with the existing brand's narrative and still makes sense to your clients, to long-standing clients as well, I think is going to be a really important one. And it will be interesting to see whether or not we see these CIOs and CTOs stepping forward into the media a little bit more to talk about their firm strategy.
Do you know why I think they will? It's a slightly cynical view, but I suspect quite an accurate one. One of the big challenges that firms face with AI is if you, Lindsay, are my client, and you and I have worked together for 5-6 years, say we do M&A or whatever it might be together, and then suddenly I'm using AI to deliver stuff to you that I've always delivered. Your first thought is, hang on, you are saving yourself time and resource for delivering this, whatever it is, to me. I'm therefore going to pay you. I should be given cost efficiencies, and I should be able to pay you less because your margin is going to go north. And firms had that with due diligence AI a decade or so ago. So the more that firms can show that there is a lot of cerebral and actual effort and resourcing going into the delivery of AI, the more they can justify keeping their rates as high as they were. So if I'm pushing my CIO or my technology team out there talking about the huge investment in AI, what we're doing, etc., that in the client's eyes gives a bit of justification as why the fees should not dip because of the efficiencies gained. That's my view.
Let's see how that plays out. For sure. Just to wrap up, there was a really interesting piece from the lawyer this morning discussing the IPO rebound. And I think we just wanted to touch on that because it made some really interesting points I think is worth digging into.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a good one to round off on, not least because it came out today. But everybody wants the IPO market here to rebound. We've been waiting for 5 or 6 years. We want the IPO market to rebound here. We want firms to stop listing in the US or have dual listings or whatever it might be. And there are green shoots now, aren't there, that is happening with a couple of,
Yeah.
big IPOs currently being mooted and happening, which is great. So obviously, hooray, 3 shares are around. However, from a law firm perspective, it's weirdly quite challenging because if you are an equity capital markets lawyer, you've either had not an awful lot to do over the last 5 or 6 years, or you've had to focus on other things. And what that means is there probably aren't that many dedicated ECM lawyers left within big firms. And if suddenly there's going to be a load of IPO work, how are you going to have enough experience and scale to be able to, service clients that want to flow? And as we all know, once you get 2 or 3 IPOs out the door, there's going to be probably 3 or 4 times that to follow. That's just the way that markets work. So, if firms think this is a thing, they're going to have to make sure that a significant number of their lawyers know their way around the equity capital markets. It's all focused on debt up until now. So I think that's quite an exciting challenge, isn't it? There might be some, as we say, respraying to be done of lawyers from other areas. I think that's going to be really, really one to watch. If we suddenly get a glut of IPOs, and obviously everybody hopes they will, a lot of those classic corporate lawyers will have been focusing on M&A or restructuring for the last 5 or 6 years or so. It might not have done a float. So yeah, big challenge.
Yeah, for sure. And thinking about, firms building out their bench strength in areas that they see as strategically important for the next, 5 to 10 years, it's very different to the unpredictability of the market. And obviously we've heard quite a lot about the AI bubble and the IPO market, and things seem very, very uncertain at the moment. So yeah, I totally agree. It's going to be requires some quick reaction to assemble teams, but I'm sure that they know that it's coming and they're going to be busy for the foreseeable, hopefully. That's all for this week's Council Culture. Thanks to Ben for joining me, and thank you for listening. You can find the links to the articles we discussed in the notes, and follow Byfield on LinkedIn for updates. And please join us next time as we continue to look at the stories shaping the business and reputation of law.
You've been listening to Council Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and join us again next week, where we'll be discussing some more of the biggest stories in the legal sector.